I need to make a withdrawal. A withdrawal? From what account, exactly? Jasmine Chin-Baptiste could hear her own heartbeat over the hum of the air conditioning. The marble floor of First Commonwealth Bank felt like it went on forever, too clean, too polished, the kind of surface that made her worn-out Converse sneakers sound louder than they should. She'd reinforced the soles twice with duct tape on the inside, where no one could see. But she knew they were falling apart. Everyone else knew too. She stood at the customer service counter, her backpack straps cutting into her shoulders, and tried to keep her voice steady. I need to make a withdrawal. Richard Holloway, the branch manager, sat behind the counter in a burgundy blazer that probably cost more than Jasmine's entire wardrobe. He looked up from his computer screen with that particular expression, the one adults use when they've already decided you don't belong. His eyes traveled down. Slowly. From her face to her faded hoodie to her jeans with the small patch on the knee to her shoes. Those shoes. The ones she'd walked 3 miles in that morning because the bus fare could buy lunch instead. The ones that had carried her through 3 years of before-school tutoring sessions and weekend volunteer shifts and late nights at the library. He smiled. Not warmly. The way people smile at children who are pretending. A withdrawal, he repeated, loud enough that the woman at the deposit slip station turned her head. From what account, exactly? Jasmine's fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper from her pocket, a withdrawal slip she'd filled out at home, each number written carefully, double-checked 3 times. She slid it across the counter. Richard glanced at it the way someone might glance at a crayon drawing. Honey, are you sure you have an account here? This is First Commonwealth. Not a credit union. Not a student savings program. The businessman in line behind her shifted his briefcase. Another customer, an older black gentleman in a postal worker uniform, stopped filling out his deposit slip and watched quietly. Jasmine felt the heat crawl up her neck, the familiar burn of being looked at like she was the mistake. I have an account here. I've had one for 3 years. Richard typed something slowly, deliberately, like he was humoring a child who insisted the tooth fairy was real. Account number? She recited it from memory. All 12 digits. Perfect. His smile wavered. He typed it in. The screen loaded, that particular kind of loading that feels like it takes hours but only lasts seconds. Jasmine watched his face. Watched the confidence start to crack at the edges. There must be. He squinted at the screen. Clicked refresh. This can't be right. It's right, Jasmine said quietly. Richard's face had gone from amused to confused to something else, something that looked like panic. His mouth opened. Closed. He refreshed the screen again. Then he looked up at her, and all the condescension was gone. Replaced by something much worse. Fear. I'm going to need to verify this with our regional office, he said, his voice suddenly formal, stripped of its earlier mockery. Why? Jasmine asked. Is there a problem with my account? No, this is highly unusual for someone your age to have money? The businessman behind her made a small sound. The postal worker near the deposit slips had fully turned now, arms crossed, watching the manager with an expression that said he'd seen the script before and knew exactly how it ended. Richard stood abruptly, his chair rolling back and hitting the partition behind him. I need to speak with my supervisor. If you'll just wait here. I'd like to make my withdrawal now, please, Jasmine said, her voice steadier than she felt. According to your posted policy, any account holder can withdraw funds during business hours without prior approval for amounts under $10,000. I'm withdrawing $800. She'd memorized that policy. Had read it 3 times on the bank's website the night before, somehow knowing, that this moment would be harder than it should be. Richard's jaw tightened. Miss Baptiste. Jasmine Baptiste. And my grandmother's name was Sylvie Baptiste. She opened this account for me when I was 13. Maybe you remember her. She said it knowing you wouldn't. Knowing that her grandmother had been invisible to men like him, just another elderly woman who came in once a month to deposit her housekeeping wages, wearing the same coat year after year, never asking for anything except to be treated with basic respect. Richard swallowed hard. I'll need to see identification. Of course. Jasmine pulled out her school ID, her hands no longer shaking. She'd been scared when she walked in. But something had shifted. Something her grandmother had tried to teach her in a letter Jasmine kept folded in her wallet. Don't let anyone make you feel small for having it. You earned this by being the kind of person I'm proud to call family. Richard took her ID with fingers that weren't quite steady. Typed something else into his computer. The screen loaded again. And Jasmine watched his face drain completely of color. What's the balance? She asked, even though she knew. She knew it down to the cent. Richard's voice came out barely above a whisper. $267,412. The businessman behind her stopped pretending not to listen. The postal worker near the deposit slip smiled, not smug, but knowing, like he'd waited his whole life to see this particular moment of reckoning. And Jasmine Baptiste, 16 years old, standing in worn-out shoes that had carried her further than anyone in this building would ever understand, said the words her grandmother had taught her to say with dignity, not triumph. Then 800 shouldn't be a problem. If you're already hooked by Jasmine's story, hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you real, gripping stories like this every week, the kind that respect your intelligence and your time. Don't miss the next one. 3 months earlier, on a Saturday morning in September, Jasmine had walked into the Boston Public Library carrying the weight of a grief she didn't know how to process yet. Her grandmother had been gone for 2 weeks. The funeral was small, maybe 15 people, mostly from the senior center where Sylvie had played cards every Thursday and the church where she'd sung in the choir for 30 years. Jasmine and her mother had sat in the front pew, holding hands so tightly their fingers went numb. The apartment felt wrong without Sylvie in it. Too quiet. Too empty. Like something essential had been removed and now the whole structure might collapse. Jasmine's mother, Lin Chen, worked 2 jobs, daytime receptionist at a dental office, evening shifts at a call center. She was working the morning Jasmine went to the library, too exhausted to do anything except sleep and wake and work again. So Jasmine went alone. She'd received a letter the day before, hand-delivered by a woman from a law office downtown, someone in a gray suit who'd looked uncomfortable standing in their building's hallway with its flickering lights and worn carpet. "This is for you," the woman had said, handing Jasmine a manila envelope. "Your grandmother arranged for it to be delivered 2 weeks after her passing. I'm very sorry for your loss." And then she'd left, heels clicking down the stairs, back to whatever world she came from where people wore suits and delivered letters from the dead. Jasmine had stared at the envelope all night. Her name written in her grandmother's handwriting, slightly shaky but still precise, the way Sylvie had written everything. Recipe cards. Grocery lists. Birthday cards that always included exactly $3 and a quote about perseverance. She couldn't open it in the apartment. Couldn't bear to read whatever her grandmother had written in those last months while Jasmine had been at school, studying for the SATs, volunteering at the senior center, pretending everything was normal while her grandmother got quieter and thinner and more tired. So she'd gone to the library. To the third floor where the study carols overlooked Copley Square. To the place where she'd spent hundreds of hours doing homework while her grandmother worked late cleaning someone else's house. She sat at her usual desk and carefully opened the envelope. Inside, 3 things. A letter, handwritten on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. A small black bankbook, the old-fashioned kind that banks didn't really use anymore. And a key, brass, worn smooth with age, attached to a tag with numbers written in her grandmother's hand. Jasmine unfolded the letter first, her hands shaking. My dearest Jasmine. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And you're probably sitting somewhere quiet trying not to cry. I know you, baby. You always were the one who held things in. Don't hold this in. Cry if you need to. I did plenty of crying myself these last few months, thinking about leaving you. But I'm not writing to make you sad. I'm writing to give you something. Something I've been saving since before you were born. Something I want you to have because you've earned it just by being who you are. Open the bank book. Don't be scared. Just look. Jasmine's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes and picked up the small black book. She opened it. The first entry was dated April 15, 1982. A deposit of $127.43. Then another. And another. Small amounts. $20. $50. Sometimes just $10. Month after month, year after year, deposits in her grandmother's neat handwriting, each one initialed by a bank teller whose name Jasmine would never know. The entries continued for pages. Decades of deposits. And at the bottom of the last page, in fresh ink, a final balance, $267,412.18. Jasmine stopped breathing. She read it again. The decimal point was in the right place. The numbers didn't change. $267,000. Her grandmother, who'd taken the bus everywhere, who'd worn the same winter coat for 15 years, who'd bought day-old bread because it was cheaper, who'd worked as a housekeeper until she was 73 years old, had saved $250,000. Jasmine looked back at the letter, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the paper. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I should have spent it. Should have made my life easier. Should have bought myself something nice. But baby, I had everything I needed. I had a roof over my head and food to eat and a granddaughter who made me prouder every single day. I didn't need fancy things. I needed to know that you would be okay. That you wouldn't have to work as hard as I did. That you could go to college without debt crushing you. That you could choose a life based on what you love, not just what pays the bills. That money is yours. All of it. I put it in an account with your name on it when you turn 13. You'll need identification to access it, but it's yours. It's been yours for 3 years. I just didn't tell you because I wanted you to keep being exactly who you are, the girl who volunteers at the senior center not for college applications but because you actually care. The girl who walks to school to save bus money. The girl who reminds me why I worked so hard in the first place. Now I need you to do something for me. I need you to take that money and use it to build a life worth living. Go to college. Study whatever sets your soul on fire. Travel if you want. Start a business. Help people the way you've always helped people. But here's the hard part, and I need you to hear this: don't let anyone make you feel small for having it. People will look at you and see a young girl, and they'll make assumptions. They'll decide you don't deserve it or didn't earn it or shouldn't have it. They'll treat you differently when they find out. Don't let them. You earn this by being the kind of person I'm proud to call family. by having character and compassion and strength. By walking through this world with dignity even when the world tried to take it from you. That money is yours. Not because of luck. Not because of charity. But because I chose to give it to someone who would honor the work it took to save it. The key is for a safety deposit box at First Commonwealth Bank downtown. Box 247. Inside, you'll find some other things. Papers. Photos. My mother's wedding ring. Things I want you to have. I love you, baby. More than I ever knew how to say when I was alive. Be brave. Be kind. Be exactly who you are. And when people underestimate you, and they will, show them what strength looks like. All my love, Grandma Sylvie. Jasmine sat in that library study corral for 2 hours, reading the letter over and over until she'd memorized every word. She looked at the bank book. At the decades of careful deposits. At the life her grandmother had lived, quiet, invisible to most people, but full of purpose and love and sacrifice. And she understood something she'd never quite grasped before. Her grandmother hadn't been poor. She'd been strategic. Every dollar saved was a brick in a foundation Sylvie was building for someone she'd never see grow up completely. Every sacrifice was an investment in a future where her granddaughter could choose her own path. Jasmine carefully folded the letter and put it in her wallet, right behind her school ID. She tucked the bank book and key into her backpack. And she walked out of that library knowing that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But also knowing that her grandmother had given her something more valuable than money. She'd given her permission to take up space in the world. To refuse to be small. To walk into rooms where people didn't think she belonged and prove them wrong just by existing. 3 months later, standing in that bank with Richard Holloway looking at her like she'd just pulled a magic trick, Jasmine understood what her grandmother had meant. This was the test. And she was ready for it. Jasmine lived on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in Dorchester, in a neighborhood where people knew each other's business because the walls were thin and the building was old and everyone's lives overlapped whether they wanted them to or not. Her mother, Lin Chen, had moved there when Jasmine was 7, after the divorce, after her father had gone back to Taiwan and stopped returning phone calls. It was all Lin could afford on a receptionist's salary, 2 bedrooms, barely, with a kitchen so small you had to stand sideways to open the refrigerator. But it was clean. And it was theirs. And for the first few years, it was enough. Then Sylvie had moved in. Jasmine's grandmother had been living alone in a studio in Roxbury, getting older, getting slower, taking the bus to housekeeping jobs that paid under the table because she'd never quite gotten her immigration paperwork sorted despite 40 years in America. Lynn had insisted she move in with them. Had given up her own bedroom and started sleeping on the pull-out couch so Sylvie could have privacy and dignity and a door that closed. That's when Jasmine learned what sacrifice looked like. Her mother working 16-hour days, coming home smelling like coffee and other people's problems, heating up leftovers at midnight, falling asleep with her work shoes still on. Her grandmother waking at 5 in the morning, ironing rich people's linens, scrubbing floors in homes with more bathrooms than their entire apartment had rooms, coming back with her knees aching and her hands raw but always asking Jasmine about her homework first. Jasmine learned to take up less space. To need less. To make herself smaller so the people she loved could have room to breathe. She learned to walk to school to save the $2.50 bus fare. 3 miles each way. 6 miles a day. In the rain. In the snow. In the worn-out Converse sneakers her mother had bought her 2 years ago from the clearance rack at Target. The shoes had been white once. Now they were gray with age and weather, the rubber toes scuffed through to the canvas, the laces replaced twice with cheaper ones that didn't quite match. She'd reinforced the inside with duct tape where the sole was separating, covering it carefully so no one at school would see. But people noticed anyway. Not the kids who took the bus or got dropped off by parents in nice cars. They didn't look at anyone's shoes. They didn't have to. But the scholarship kids, the ones who understood that shoes were currency in a language no one wanted to speak, they noticed. And they didn't say anything, because what was there to say? They wore the same uniform of making do, of stretching things past their breaking point, of praying nothing would fall apart before you could afford to replace it. Jasmine walked those 6 miles every day for 2 years. And with every step, she got stronger. Not just physically, though her legs became lean and muscular in a way that made her faster than half the track team even though she'd never tried out. But mentally. Each mile was time to think. Time to process. Time away from the cramped apartment where her mother's exhaustion filled every room and her grandmother's worry hung in the air like humidity. She thought about college. About the schools she wanted to apply to, Boston University, Northeastern, maybe even MIT if she could get her math scores high enough. She knew she couldn't afford them. Knew that even with financial aid, the gap between what they offered and what her family could pay was a chasm too wide to cross. But she applied anyway. Because her grandmother told her to. "You apply," Sylvie had said, sitting at their small kitchen table, her arthritic hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "You apply and you see what happens. Don't decide for them that you're not good enough. Make them decide. And if they say no, at least you tried." So Jasmine applied. And studied. And volunteered at the senior center on weekends, reading to elderly people who reminded her of her grandmother, people who'd worked their whole lives and had nothing to show for it except sore joints and fading memories and the kindness of strangers who sometimes weren't very kind at all. She tutored younger kids at the library for free, helping them with math and English, watching their faces light up when something finally made sense. She worked a summer job at a corner store, 8 hours on her feet for minimum wage, saving every dollar for college application fees and SAT prep books from the thrift store. She did all of this in shoes that were falling apart. And she never complained. Because complaining required energy she didn't have, and pride she couldn't afford. Her best friend, Maya Rodriguez, had offered to buy her new shoes once. They'd been at the mall, Maya shopping with her mother's credit card, Jasmine window shopping, the way she always did. Maya had stopped outside Foot Locker, seen a pair of sneakers on sale, and said, "Let me get those for you. Early birthday present." Jasmine had felt her face burn. "I'm good. Jazz, your shoes are literally held together with tape." I said I'm good. Maya had backed off. Had understood, somehow, that charity hurt more than worn-out shoes ever could. That accepting help meant admitting need, and admitting need meant accepting that you were less than, different from, not quite enough. So Jasmine kept walking. 6 miles a day. 1,200 miles a year. 2,400 miles in 2 years. In shoes that cost $24.99 on clearance. Those were the shoes she wore to the bank that December morning. The shoes Richard Holloway had looked at with such obvious disdain, as if poverty were a moral failing rather than an economic reality. The shoes that had carried her further than he would ever understand. And when he'd asked to see identification, when he'd pulled up her account and seen that balance, seen the proof that she belonged in his bank, in his space, in the conversation about money that people like him thought belonged only to people like them, Jasmine had thought about those shoes. About every mile they'd walked. Every step they'd taken. Every time she'd been too tired to keep going but did anyway because stopping wasn't an option. Those shoes were falling apart. But they'd gotten her here. To this counter. To this moment. To the place where she could finally say, "I'm not asking for your permission anymore. I'm demanding your respect." And she was going to get it. After the initial shock wore off, after Richard Holloway had stammered through an apology that didn't quite reach his eyes and processed her withdrawal with hands that shook slightly, Jasmine had asked about the safety deposit box. "Box 247, she'd said, showing him the key her grandmother had left. "I need to access it." Richard had recovered some of his composure by then, though his professionalism now carried a different weight. He was no longer dismissive. He was careful. The kind of careful people become when they realize they've misjudged someone badly and are trying to calculate how much damage control they need to do. "Of course, Miss Jean-Baptiste. Right this way." He'd led her through a door behind the teller stations, down a hallway that smelled like old paper and metal, into a room lined floor to ceiling with small brass doors, each one numbered and locked. Box 247 was at eye level. Small. Unassuming. Richard had used his master key first, then stepped aside to let Jasmine use hers. The mechanism clicked. The small door swung open, revealing a long metal drawer. "I'll give you privacy," Richard had said, gesturing to a small table in the corner. "Take as much time as you need." He'd left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. And Jasmine had been alone with whatever her grandmother had left behind. She carried the metal box to the table, her hands trembling slightly. The box was heavier than she expected. She sat down in the worn leather chair and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, layers of memory. On top, a manila envelope labeled "Important Papers" in her grandmother's handwriting. Beneath that, a smaller jewelry box, dark blue velvet worn smooth with age. And underneath everything, photographs, dozens of them, some in black and white, some in faded color, spanning decades. Jasmine opened the envelope first. Birth certificates. Her grandmother's, yellowed with age, from Haiti, a country Jasmine had never visited but heard stories about late at night when Sylvie couldn't sleep and would sit in the kitchen telling tales about mangoes and ocean breezes and a life left behind. Immigration papers. Work permits. Social security cards. The documentation of a life lived in the margins, always one step away from deportation, always careful, always quiet. And at the bottom, something that made Jasmine's breath catch, her college fund documents. Proof that her grandmother had been planning this for years. Had been saving not just randomly but strategically, with specific purpose. There were calculations in the margins, numbers showing compound interest, projected costs of tuition, estimates of what Jasmine would need for 4 years at different universities. Her grandmother had done the math. Had figured out exactly how much to save and for how long. This wasn't luck. This wasn't an accident. This was a plan executed across decades. Jasmine set the papers aside and opened the jewelry box. Inside, resting on faded satin, was a ring. Gold, thin, worn smooth with age. Set with a small stone that might have been a diamond or might have been glass, Jasmine couldn't tell and didn't care. She'd seen her grandmother wear this ring exactly once, at Jasmine's 8th grade graduation. Sylvie had taken it out of a drawer, slipped it on her finger, and worn it for those 2 hours before carefully putting it away again, back in whatever hiding place kept it safe from the everyday whir of housework and bus rides and living. My mother's wedding ring, Sylvie had told her that day. The only thing I brought from Haiti. The only thing worth bringing. And now it was Jasmine's. She slipped it on her right ring finger. It fit perfectly, as if her grandmother had known it would. As if even this small detail had been planned with the same careful attention Sylvie had given everything else. Finally, Jasmine turned to the photographs. The first one showed a young woman, barely 20, standing in front of a small house with a tin roof, palm trees visible in the background, the colors faded to pastels by time and sun. The woman was beautiful, with smooth dark skin and eyes that looked directly at the camera with something like defiance. Jasmine recognized her grandmother's face in that young woman's features, but barely. This person looked fearless, unbroken, full of a future she couldn't yet see. The next photos showed the journey: Sylvie in Miami, looking lost and overwhelmed, standing in front of a bus station with a single suitcase. Sylvie in Boston, snow on the ground, her first winter, wearing a coat too thin for New England cold. Sylvie in an apartment that might have been her first, smiling despite the peeling wallpaper and bare floors. Then came the work photos. Sylvie in a maid's uniform, standing in someone's gleaming kitchen, holding a mop. Sylvie with other housekeepers, all of them Caribbean or Latina, all of them wearing the same expression of tired dignity. Sylvie at a bus stop, waiting, always waiting. And then, babies. Jasmine's mother as an infant, wrapped in a blanket that looked handmade. Lynn as a toddler, serious-faced and wide-eyed. School photos spanning years, kindergarten through high school, her mother growing up in frames. And finally, Jasmine herself. Her own childhood documented in the same careful way. Every school photo. Every birthday. Christmas mornings in their cramped apartment, a small tree in the corner, presents wrapped in newspaper because wrapping paper was expensive. At the bottom of the stack, one last photograph. Recent. Maybe from last year. Jasmine hadn't known it existed. It showed Jasmine at the senior center, reading to an elderly man in a wheelchair. She was leaning forward, book open on her lap, completely focused. The man was smiling at her with pure joy. Someone had taken this photo without her knowing. Someone had captured this moment and given it to her grandmother. And on the back, in Sylvie's handwriting, "This is why." Jasmine sat in that small room with its metal boxes and its smell of old paper and its weight of accumulated lives, and she cried for the first time since her grandmother died. Not quiet tears. Not dignified grief. She sobbed. Gut deep. The kind of crying that comes from understanding something too big to hold. Her grandmother had saved for 40 years. Had lived small so Jasmine could live big. Had worked until her hands couldn't grip anymore, until her knees gave out, until she had nothing left except the legacy she'd built $1 at a time. And she'd done it because of a girl reading to an old man in a wheelchair. Because of kindness that didn't expect anything in return. Because of character measured not in money but in moments when no one was watching. Jasmine gathered the papers, the ring, the photographs. She put everything carefully back into the metal box. She wiped her face. Straightened her shoulders. Put on the ring that had traveled from Haiti to Miami to Boston, carried by a woman who'd understood that wealth wasn't measured in what you kept but in what you gave away. And she walked out of that room knowing something she hadn't fully grasped before. Her grandmother hadn't just left her money. She'd left her proof. Proof that hard work mattered. That sacrifice meant something. That a life lived with purpose could echo across generations. Richard Holloway was waiting outside, his expression still careful and calculated. "Everything okay?" he asked. Jasmine looked at him, at his expensive blazer and his assumption that she'd need his approval, his permission, his validation. "Everything's perfect," she said. And walked out of the bank with her head high, her grandmother's ring on her finger, and $800 in her pocket for the new winter coat she desperately needed but had been too proud to ask her mother for. The shoes would last a little longer. Everything else could wait. But the coat, that was something she could buy without guilt now. Something practical. Something her grandmother would have insisted on. Stay warm, baby. That's what Sylvie would have said. You can't change the world if you're freezing. So Jasmine walked to the department store 3 blocks away, in her falling-apart shoes and her too-thin jacket, and bought herself a proper winter coat for the first time in her life. And she didn't feel guilty about it at all. Jasmine didn't tell her mother about the money. Not that first day. Not that first week. Not for an entire month after she'd opened the safety deposit box and understood the full weight of what her grandmother had left behind. She came home that December afternoon with a new winter coat, navy blue, properly insulated, with a hood that actually blocked wind, and her mother had looked up from the couch where she was folding laundry, exhausted from her morning shift. "Where'd you get that?" Jasmine had hesitated for only a second. They were having a sale. "I've been saving." It wasn't exactly a lie. She had been saving. She'd just been saving someone else's money before it became legally hers. Lynn had studied her daughter with tired eyes that missed nothing. "How much?" $40. Clearance rack. Another half-truth. The coat had cost $87. But Jasmine had paid in cash and there was no receipt for her mother to find and worry over. Lynn had nodded slowly, accepting this because she wanted to believe it, because she needed to believe that her daughter wasn't sacrificing more than she should. "Good. You needed that. It's going to be a cold winter." And Jasmine had hung the coat in the closet they shared, next to her mother's worn uniform jacket and her grandmother's old pea coat that neither of them could bear to give away yet. She'd kept the secret for a reason. Her mother was proud. Painfully proud. The kind of pride that came from working 2 jobs and raising a child alone and never, ever accepting help from anyone if she could possibly avoid it. When Sylvie had been alive, Lynn had insisted on paying her mother rent, $50 a week, a token amount that barely covered utilities, but it mattered. It meant Lynn wasn't accepting charity, even from family. When the landlord had tried to raise their rent 2 years ago, Lynn had worked overtime for 3 months straight to cover the difference rather than ask for help or move somewhere cheaper and further from Jasmine's school. When Jasmine's guidance counselor had mentioned scholarship programs that required financial documentation, Lynn had filled out every form with careful precision, her handwriting neat and small, her shame at having to prove their poverty visible in the tightness of her jaw. Jasmine understood that pride because she'd inherited it. That's why she'd walk 6 miles a day rather than ask her mother for bus money. That's why she'd patched her shoes with duct tape rather than mention they were falling apart. That's why she'd never, not once, complained about being hungry or cold or tired. Because complaining meant admitting need. And admitting need meant becoming a burden. And Jasmine would rather die than be a burden to the woman who'd already sacrificed everything. So she kept the secret. She kept going to school. Kept volunteering at the senior center. Kept walking in her worn-out shoes even though she could now afford to replace them 100 times over. She did buy some things, carefully. Small things her mother wouldn't question. A new backpack when her old one's zipper finally broke beyond repair. Some SAT prep books, used, from the thrift store, so her mother wouldn't wonder where the money came from. A winter hat and gloves set on sale, because going without them in Boston winter was genuinely dangerous and her mother would be relieved rather than suspicious. But mostly, she saved it. Let it sit in that account gathering dust and interest while she figured out what to do. What her grandmother would have wanted her to do. The letter had been clear: college. That was the purpose. That was the plan. But her mother didn't know about the letter. Didn't know about the account. Didn't know that while she was working herself to exhaustion to save maybe a few $1,000s for community college tuition, Jasmine was sitting on $250,000 that could change both their lives. And Jasmine couldn't figure out how to tell her without breaking something fragile between them. One night in January, 2 months after finding the safety deposit box, Jasmine lay awake in the bed she'd once shared with her grandmother. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the space heater in the corner and the distant sound of the upstairs neighbor's television. Her mother was asleep on the pull-out couch in the living room. Had been asleep for maybe an hour, fully clothed except for her shoes, too tired to change into pajamas after her evening shift. Jasmine got up quietly and went to the kitchen. She pulled out her laptop and opened the document she'd been working on for weeks, a spreadsheet. One column, what the money could do. Pay off her mother's credit card debt, $4,200. Replace the ancient car that barely started in cold weather, $8,000 used. Move to a better apartment, maybe with 2 actual bedrooms, $1,800 per month instead of $1,100. Let her mother quit one job. Pay for Jasmine's college, all 4 years, anywhere she got in. Another column, what it would cost. Her mother's pride, shattered. The careful independence Lynn had built across 18 years as a single mother, undermined. The self-respect that came from providing for your child, stolen. The knowledge that her own mother had been hiding money while Lynn worked herself to exhaustion, preserved like a wound that couldn't heal. Jasmine stared at the spreadsheet until the numbers blurred. She thought about what her grandmother had written, "Don't let anyone make you feel small for having it." But her grandmother hadn't said anything about making someone else feel small by having it. Hadn't warned her that money could be a weapon even when you didn't mean it to be. That revealing wealth could feel like revealing betrayal when the person you loved had been struggling while you secretly had the solution. She closed the laptop. The money would stay secret. For now. Until she could figure out how to make this gift into something that didn't hurt. Until she could find a way to honor both her grandmother's sacrifice and her mother's pride. Until she could be sure that helping wouldn't feel like judgment. So she kept walking to school. Kept working at the corner store on weekends. Kept living the same life she'd always lived while carrying a secret that grew heavier every day. Her mother came home exhausted and Jasmine said nothing. Bills piled up and Jasmine said nothing. Lynn talked about community college because it was affordable and Jasmine said nothing, even though she'd been accepted to Boston University with a partial scholarship that she could now easily cover the difference for. She said nothing because she didn't know how to say everything. And in the silence, the distance between them grew, invisible but real, like all the best lies. Jasmine told herself it was temporary. That she'd find the right time, the right words, the right way to explain without hurting. But every day that passed made the secret bigger. Made the eventual revelation more impossible. Made the question more pressing. How do you tell someone you love that you've been carrying the solution to all their problems while watching them suffer? How do you say, "I could have helped, but I didn't know how to offer without taking something away from you"? How do you explain that sometimes, hiding wealth is its own kind of poverty? Jasmine didn't have answers. So she kept her grandmother's ring on her finger, told her mother it was costume jewelry from a thrift store, and went back to the bank every 2 weeks to check the account balance, watching it grow slightly with interest while her mother's exhaustion grew with every shift. And she hated herself a little more each time. But not enough to speak. Not yet. It was Mrs. Patel, Jasmine's guidance counselor, who forced the conversation Jasmine had been avoiding. The meeting was scheduled for after school on a Thursday in late February. Jasmine sat in the small office with its motivational posters and college pennants and a desk so cluttered with paper that it looked like someone had given up on organization entirely. Mrs. Patel was in her 50s, Indian American, with the kind of directness that came from 2 decades of dealing with teenagers who didn't know how to ask for help. She'd been Jasmine's counselor since freshman year, had watched her test scores climb, had written recommendation letters praising her character and determination. She was also the person who knew exactly how much Jasmine's family struggled. "Jasmine," Mrs. Patel said, settling into her chair, "we need to talk about your college situation." Jasmine's stomach tightened. "Okay. You've been accepted to Boston University. Full scholarship to UMass. Partial scholarships to Northeastern and Simmons. These are excellent options. I know. But I haven't seen you respond to any of them. Acceptance deadline for BU is in 3 weeks." Jasmine looked down at her hands, at her grandmother's ring, which she'd stopped pretending was costume jewelry because Mrs. Patel had seen through that lie immediately. "I'm still deciding," Jasmine said quietly. "Between what? BU is an incredible opportunity. Their financial aid office estimated your family contribution at maybe $2,000 a year. With a work-study, you could cover that easily. $2,000. Pocket change compared to what Jasmine had. Nothing. She could write a check today for all 4 years and not even notice the money was gone. But she couldn't say that. Couldn't explain that the problem wasn't money. It was what the money represented. "My mom's been talking about community college," Jasmine said carefully. "Thinks it makes more sense. I could live at home, save money." Mrs. Patel leaned forward. "Jasmine, I've worked with hundreds of students. I can tell when someone's making excuses. What's really going on?" "Nothing. Is this about your mother?" Jasmine's head snapped up. "What?" "I've met Lynn. She came in for your sophomore year parent conference. She's a good woman. Very proud. Very independent." Mrs. Patel chose the word carefully. The kind of mother who'd work herself into the ground before she'd let her daughter take on debt. Jasmine's throat tightened. "She wants me close. Wants me to commute. Does she know about your grandmother's inheritance?" The question hit like a slap. Jasmine stared at Mrs. Patel, her mind racing. "How did you?" "Sylvie called me. Last spring. Before she passed. She wanted to make sure you had someone at school who knew. Someone who could help you navigate financial aid forms when the time came." Mrs. Patel's expression softened. She was very worried about you carrying that knowledge alone. Jasmine felt tears prick her eyes. "My mom doesn't know." "Why not?" "Because," Jasmine's voice broke. "Because she's been killing herself working 2 jobs to save money for my education. And I've been sitting on $250,000 watching her do it. How do I tell her that? How do I say, 'Hey Mom, remember all those extra shifts you worked? Remember sleeping on the couch for 4 years? Remember crying over bills you thought I couldn't hear?' None of it was necessary. Grandma already handled it." Mrs. Patel was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandmother didn't tell her either." "No. Why do you think that is?" Jasmine wiped her eyes. "Because she knew Mom would refuse it. Would see it as charity. Would work even harder to prove she didn't need help. And if you tell her now, she'll feel like she failed. Like Grandma didn't trust her to provide. Like I don't need her anymore." Jasmine's voice dropped to a whisper. "Money doesn't just solve problems. Sometimes it creates them." Mrs. Patel stood and walked to her window, looking out at the parking lot where students were leaving for the day. "When I came to America for college, my parents sold our house in Mumbai to pay for it. Everything they had. I didn't know until years later, until I was already graduated and working and couldn't give it back. She turned to face Jasmine. I was angry at first. Felt guilty. Felt like their sacrifice was a weight I'd carry forever. But then I realized something. They didn't sacrifice for my guilt. They sacrificed for my possibility. And the best way to honor that was to use what they'd given me to build something worth building. It's not the same, Jasmine said. Isn't it? Your grandmother worked 40 years saving that money. She could have spent it on herself. Could have made her own life easier. But she chose to invest in your future. Not because she thought your mother was failing, but because she saw a young woman who deserved every opportunity. Mom doesn't see it that way. No, she probably won't. Not at first. Mrs. Patel sat back down, her expression gentle but firm. But you have to tell her, Jasmine. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because hiding it is hurting both of you. Jasmine shook her head. I don't know how. Start with the truth. Show her the letter. Let her see what your grandmother wrote. Let her understand that this wasn't about doubting Lynn's ability to provide. It was about love taking a different form. What if she's angry? She will be. Probably at your grandmother for not telling her. Maybe at you for waiting so long. Definitely at the situation for being complicated. Mrs. Patel leaned forward. But underneath the anger will be relief. Because your mother loves you more than her pride, Jasmine. And given the choice between her ego and your future, she'll choose your future every single time. Jasmine sat with that for a moment. BU wants an answer in 3 weeks. Then you have 3 weeks to have the hardest conversation of your life. But Jasmine? Mrs. Patel's voice was kind but unyielding. You don't get to sacrifice your future because you're scared of your mother's reaction. Your grandmother didn't save for 40 years so you could choose community college out of guilt. Jasmine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. One more thing, Mrs. Patel said. That inheritance? It's not just money. It's your grandmother saying, I believe in you enough to give you choices I never had. Don't dishonor that by choosing the small option because it feels safer. After the meeting, Jasmine sat on the steps outside school until the sun started to set and the February cold seeped through her new winter coat. She pulled out her phone and read her grandmother's letter for the 100th time. Don't let anyone make you feel small for having it. Anyone. Including yourself. Including the fear of what your mother might think or feel or say. Jasmine stood. Put her phone away. Started the 3-mile walk home. Tonight, she decided. She'd tell her mother tonight. Before fear could change her mind. Before guilt could paralyze her. Before the secret grew so big it destroyed the relationship she was trying to protect. Tonight. The word felt like a promise and a threat all at once. But Mrs. Patel was right about one thing. Her grandmother hadn't saved for 40 years so Jasmine could choose the safe, small option. She'd saved so Jasmine could choose the life worth living. Even if that choice came with consequences neither of them could predict. Jasmine's mother was folding laundry when she got home, whites and colors separated into neat piles on the pull-out couch that served as Lynn's bed. The apartment smelled like the lavender detergent they bought in bulk from the discount store. Hey, baby, Lynn said without looking up. There's leftover chicken in the fridge if you're hungry. Jasmine set her backpack down by the door. Her heart was pounding so hard she wondered if her mother could hear it. Mom? Can we talk? Something in her voice made Lynn look up. What's wrong? Did something happen at school? No. Nothing like that. Jasmine's courage faltered. Can you sit down? Lynn's expression shifted to concern. She set down the shirt she was folding and sat on the edge of the couch. "You're scaring me." Jasmine pulled out her grandmother's letter from her backpack, the one she'd been carrying for months, folded and refolded so many times the creases were wearing thin. She sat down beside her mother. "Grandma left me something," Jasmine said quietly. "More than just the ring. She left me a letter. And I need you to read it." Lynn took the letter with hands that had started trembling slightly. "When did you get this?" "September. Right after the funeral. A lawyer brought it." "And you're just telling me now?" Lynn's voice had an edge Jasmine had been dreading. "I didn't know how." "Please just read it first. Then you can be angry." Lynn unfolded the letter carefully, as if it might break. Jasmine watched her mother's face as she read, watched the confusion give way to shock, then disbelief, then something that looked like pain mixed with wonder. When Lynn reached the part about the money, her hands started shaking harder. She had to set the letter down on her lap to keep reading. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face silently. They sat in silence for a long time. The space heater hummed in the corner. Upstairs, someone dropped something heavy. Finally, Lynn spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. $267,000. Yes. My mother saved $267,000. Her voice broke. While I worked myself to death trying to save maybe 5,000. Mom. Did you know? While she was alive, did you know? No. She kept it secret from both of us. Lynn picked up the letter again, reading it a second time as if she'd missed something crucial. She was planning this for years. Look at these calculations. She knew exactly how much college would cost. She wanted to make sure I'd be okay. So she let me. Lynn's voice hardened. She let me kill myself working overtime. Let me sleep on this goddamn couch for 4 years. Let me skip meals so you could eat. And all that time, she was sitting on enough money to change our entire lives. The anger Jasmine had been dreading was emerging now, sharp and hot and directed at someone who wasn't here to defend herself. She did it because she loved us, Jasmine said carefully. She did it because she didn't trust me. Lynn stood abruptly, pacing the small living room. She didn't think I could provide for you. Thought she had to do it herself. Thought I was. That's not what the letter says. Then what does it say, Jasmine? Because all I'm reading is that my mother thought I was failing you. That I wasn't enough. It says she wanted to give me choices. That's not the same as saying you weren't enough. Lynn stopped pacing, her back to Jasmine. How long have you known? Since September. 5 months. You've known for 5 months and didn't tell me. I didn't know how. Lynn turned, and her expression was something Jasmine had never seen before, hurt and anger and betrayal all mixed together. I asked you where you got that coat. You lied to me. I didn't want to hurt you. Well, you did. You both did. Lynn's voice cracked. Do you know how many times I've cried over money? How many nights I've stayed awake doing math, trying to figure out how to pay for your college? How many extra shifts I've worked until I couldn't stand up straight? I know, Mom. That's why I didn't. And all that time, you knew. You knew there was money. You knew I was killing myself for nothing. And you said nothing. Jasmine felt her own tears starting. What was I supposed to say? Hey Mom, Grandma left me a fortune, so all your sacrifice was pointless. It wasn't pointless. Lynn's voice rose, years of exhaustion and fear breaking through. It was me being your mother. It was me doing my job. And she took that away from me. You both took it away by keeping secrets. We were trying to protect you. I don't need protection. I needed honesty. Lynn stopped, covering her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs that had been building for months, maybe years. Jasmine stood and tried to hug her mother, but Lynn stepped back, shaking her head. Don't. I can't, I need a minute. She walked to her bedroom, the one that used to be Jasmine's, the one she'd given to her own mother and never taken back after Sylvie died, and closed the door. Jasmine stood alone in the living room, surrounded by half-folded laundry and the ghost of a conversation that had gone exactly as badly as she'd feared. She picked up her grandmother's letter from where her mother had dropped it and read the last lines again. Be brave. Be kind. Be exactly who you are. And when people underestimate you, and they will, show them what strength looks like. But Sylvie hadn't said what to do when the person you had to be strong with was the person you loved most. When being brave meant hurting someone. When being kind meant keeping secrets that festered into wounds. Jasmine folded the letter carefully and put it back in her backpack. From behind the closed bedroom door, she could hear her mother crying, the kind of crying that comes from exhaustion and relief and anger and grief all mixed together into something too complicated to name. Jasmine cleaned up the laundry, folding everything with the same precision her mother always used. She heated up the leftover chicken and ate it even though she had no appetite, because throwing food away felt wrong when everything else felt like it was breaking. And she waited. For her mother to emerge. For the anger to pass. For whatever came next. Because Mrs. Patel had been right about one thing, the conversation was necessary. But she'd been wrong about the relief. There was no relief yet. Just pain and truth sitting in the same room, trying to figure out how to coexist. Lynn didn't speak to Jasmine for 3 days. Not out of cruelty. But because she didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to process the revelation that her entire understanding of the past 4 years, her sacrifice, her struggle, her identity as a mother who provided, had been built on incomplete information. She went to work. Came home. Ate meals Jasmine prepared in silence. Went to bed early. The apartment felt smaller with all that unspoken hurt taking up space. On the 3rd night, Jasmine found her mother sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, staring at her grandmother's letter under the weak overhead light. Can't sleep? Jasmine asked quietly from the doorway. Lynn didn't look up. I keep reading this, trying to find the part where she explains why she didn't tell me. Jasmine sat down across from her. Maybe she was protecting you too. From what? From being able to breathe? From not having to work myself to exhaustion? Lynn's voice was tired, not angry anymore. Just tired. I don't understand what she was protecting me from. From feeling like you weren't enough. Lynn looked up finally. That doesn't make sense. Doesn't it? Jasmine leaned forward. If Grandma had told you about the money, would you have let me use it? Of course. Would you have used any yourself? To quit one job? To move to a better place? To stop killing yourself? Lynn's silence was answer enough. See? You would have insisted on doing it yourself anyway. Would have worked even harder to prove you didn't need help. That's what Grandma was protecting you from. The need to prove something that was never in question. I'm her daughter. I had a right to know. You did. But she loved you enough to know that telling you would hurt you differently than not telling you. Jasmine picked up the letter, pointing to a specific line. Look. She says right here, I had everything I needed. She wasn't suffering, Mom. She was choosing. She was choosing to save because it gave her purpose. It gave her something to work toward. She could have worked toward her own comfort. She was comfortable. She had us. She had a roof and food and family. Everything else was extra. Jasmine set the letter down. Sometimes love looks like sacrifice. And sometimes it looks like secrets. She did what she thought was best. Lynn was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing the worn creases in the letter. I'm still angry. I know. At her. At you. At myself for not noticing. You couldn't have noticed. She was too good at hiding it. Was she happy? Lynn's voice broke slightly. Working until her hands gave out? Living in that tiny room? Never spending money on herself? I think so, Jasmine said honestly. I think she was happy because she had a plan. Because she knew exactly what she was building. Because every dollar she saved was a brick in something bigger than herself. Lynn wiped her eyes. I don't know how to accept this. You don't have to accept it all at once. You just have to decide what to do with it now that you know. What do you want to do? Go to Boston University. The words hung in the air between them. This was the first time Jasmine had said it out loud. Lynn looked at her daughter, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since the conversation had exploded 3 days ago. You've already been accepted? Full scholarship. I just need to cover room and board. Maybe $2,000 a year. You could live at home. Commute. I could. But Grandma saved so I wouldn't have to. So I could have the full experience. Dorms and late-night study groups and learning to be independent. You're already independent. In some ways. But Mom. Jasmine took a breath. I've been taking care of myself since I was 12. Making sure I didn't need anything so you wouldn't have to worry. Walking to school to save money. Patching my shoes instead of asking for new ones. Being small so you could have space to breathe. I never asked you to do that. I know. But I did it anyway because I love you. Because I saw how hard you worked and I didn't want to add to it. Jasmine's voice got stronger. But Grandma's money means I don't have to be small anymore. It means I can take up space. Can choose the bigger life. Can actually be a kid for the first time instead of a burden you have to calculate. Lynn's face crumpled. You were never a burden. But I felt like one. Every time you worked overtime. Every time you skipped meals. Every time you slept on that couch instead of taking your own room back. I kept track, Mom. Of every sacrifice. And I've been trying to be worth it. You've always been worth it. Then let me use this money the way Grandma intended. Let me go to BU and live on campus and figure out who I am when I'm not trying to take up as little space as possible. Lynn was crying now, properly crying, and this time when Jasmine reached for her, she didn't pull away. They held each other in the dim kitchen while the space heater hummed and the upstairs neighbor walked across their floor and the city breathed outside their window. I'm scared, Lynn admitted into Jasmine's shoulder. What if you don't need me anymore? I'll always need you. Money doesn't change that. But you'll be gone. Living somewhere else. Building a life I'm not part of. You'll still be part of it. Just differently. Jasmine pulled back to look at her mother. And Mom? The money's not just mine. It's ours. Grandma left it for my education, but there's enough that we can use some to make your life easier too. No. Mom. No. That money is yours. Your grandmother saved it for you, not for me. I'm not taking it. Even if I want you to have it. Even then, Lynn's jaw set with familiar stubbornness. I'm not your grandmother, Jasmine. I'm not sacrificing and saving so you can feel guilty. I'm working because that's what I do. Because it gives me purpose. Because taking care of you has been the only thing that's made sense since your father left. Jasmine recognized that tone. Her mother wouldn't be moved on this. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Okay, she said. But will you let me use it for school? Will you let me go to BU? Lynn was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Yes. But I want to read every financial aid document. Want to understand exactly where the money's going. Want to make sure you're not spending it stupidly. Deal. And you have to come home on weekends sometimes. I don't care how much studying you have. You come home. I will. And you have to call me. Every day. Even if it's just for 5 minutes. Mom. Every day, Jasmine. Or I'm coming to campus and embarrassing you in front of your new college friends. Jasmine smiled despite herself. Every day. I promise. Lynn picked up her grandmother's letter one more time, reading it again with different eyes now. Eyes that saw not betrayal but love in its most complicated form. She really thought this through, Lynn said softly. Look at these calculations. She knew exactly how much I was saving. She was tracking it. Making sure her money would fill the gaps mine couldn't. She was proud of you, Mom. The letter says that too. Lynn found the line, reading it aloud. Lynn works so hard. Harder than anyone should have to. But that's not failure. That's strength. I'm not saving because she isn't enough. I'm saving because she's given everything, and someone needs to make sure Jasmine has more than just enough. She set the letter down and looked at Jasmine. I think I'm going to need time to forgive her for not telling me. But I think I understand now why she didn't. That's all anyone can ask. They sat together at the kitchen table until the sky started to lighten outside the window, talking through details and fears and possibilities. Planning for a future that suddenly looked different than either of them had imagined. And somewhere, in whatever place grandmothers go after they've saved every dollar and written every letter and left every legacy they can manage, Sylvie Baptiste smiled. Because her plan had worked exactly as intended. Not to replace Lynn's sacrifice with money. But to make sure that sacrifice meant something more than survival. To make sure it meant possibility. 2 weeks after the kitchen table conversation, Jasmine received a phone call from First Commonwealth Bank. She was at the library studying for her calculus final when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Miss Chin Baptiste? This is Richard Holloway from First Commonwealth Bank. Jasmine's first instinct was to hang up. She didn't need whatever this was. Didn't want to revisit the humiliation of standing at that counter being judged by her shoes. But curiosity won. Yes? I wanted to apologize. Properly. Not just the corporate apology I gave you that day. A real one. He sounded uncomfortable, like this wasn't something he did often. Would you be willing to meet with me? Briefly. I promise this isn't a sales call. Jasmine hesitated. Why? Because I've been thinking about what happened. And I need to say some things. To your face. If you're willing. Against her better judgment, she agreed. They met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the bank, neutral territory. Richard arrived in a regular coat, no blazer, looking older and more human than he had behind the counter. He bought her a hot chocolate without asking if she wanted it and sat down across from her in a booth by the window. Thank you for coming, he said. Jasmine didn't respond. Just waited. Richard took a breath. What I did to you was wrong. Not just unprofessional. Wrong. I looked at you and I made assumptions based on your appearance. Your age. He stopped himself. I judged you before you even opened your mouth. I noticed. I've been working in banking for 28 years. I've seen a lot of people come through those doors. And somewhere along the way, I started believing I could tell who mattered and who didn't based on how they looked. You can't, Jasmine said flatly. I know that now. But I didn't then. Or maybe I did and I just didn't care because it was easier to dismiss people than to treat everyone with the same respect. He looked down at his coffee. After you left that day, I couldn't stop thinking about your face when I was laughing at you. You weren't angry. You were just dignified. Like you'd expected it. Like you'd dealt with people like me before and had learned not to let it break you. I have dealt with people like you before. Every time I walk into a store. Every time I'm in a nice restaurant with my mother. Every time someone looks at us and decides we don't belong. I'm sorry. Why are you telling me this? What do you want? Forgiveness? Richard shook his head. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that what happened had nothing to do with you and everything to do with me. With my biases. With the way I've been trained by this system to value certain people over others. Trained by who? By everyone. By the industry. By the way we reward employees for attracting high-value clients and discourage them from spending time with people who have smaller accounts. By the way we're taught to spot risk factors, which is just code for profiling. He met her eyes. By the way I was raised to believe that wealth meant worth. Jasmine studied him. He looked sincere. Looked like he'd actually been thinking about this, not just covering his professional ass. What changed? She asked. I have a daughter. 15. About your age. Richard's voice got quieter. After you left, I went home and I looked at her and I thought, if she walked into a bank and someone treated her the way I treated you, I'd be furious. I'd want that person fired. So you're apologizing because you have a daughter? I'm apologizing because I finally saw you as someone's daughter. As a whole person instead of a transaction. And I'm ashamed it took me that long. Jasmine sipped her hot chocolate. It was good. Better than she expected. Your apology doesn't undo what happened. I know. And it doesn't make me feel better about the fact that if I'd actually been poor, if I'd actually been some kid with no money trying to open a savings account, you would have treated me exactly the same way. You're right. I would have. So what's the point of this? Of you feeling bad? Does it change anything? Richard was quiet for a moment. It changes me. I've requested additional training. Implicit bias. Cultural competency. I've asked to shadow some of our loan officers who work with low-income communities. I want to understand what I've been missing. Good for you. I also spoke to my supervisor. Asked if we could review our customer service protocols. How we train staff to interact with young clients, with people who don't fit our typical demographic profile. Jasmine looked at him more carefully now. You're actually trying to fix it. I'm trying. I don't know if it'll work. I don't know if I can unlearn 28 years of conditioning. But I'm trying because what I did to you was unconscionable, and you deserved better. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside the window, Boston moved past in its usual rush, people bundled against March cold, cars navigating slushy streets, the city indifferent to individual moments of reckoning. Can I ask you something? Richard said. Sure. How did you stay so calm? When I was dismissing you, when I was laughing at you, you just stood there with this dignity. How? Jasmine thought about her grandmother. About years of watching Sylvie come home from cleaning houses where people barely acknowledged her existence. About the quiet strength it took to be invisible and still maintain your humanity. My grandmother taught me that people's behavior toward me says more about them than it does about me, Jasmine said. She taught me that I don't have to shrink to make other people comfortable with their own limitations. Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. She saved for 40 years so I could have this conversation with you as an equal instead of someone asking for permission to exist in your space. Richard nodded slowly. The money in your account, that was hers? She left it to me. Every dollar earned cleaning houses and riding buses and never buying anything for herself. She saved it so I'd never have to feel the way she felt. Invisible. Disposable. Less than. And then I made you feel exactly that way. Yes. I'm sorry, Jasmine. Truly. Jasmine finished her hot chocolate. She didn't forgive him, wasn't sure she ever would, but she believed he was sorry. Believed he was trying, even if trying didn't undo the harm. Can I give you some advice? She asked. Please. Don't just change how you treat young people or people who don't look wealthy. Change how you think about wealth itself. Because the person at your counter with designer clothes and a trust fund isn't more valuable than the person with worn-out shoes and a savings account. They're just luckier. And luck isn't virtue. You're right. And another thing. Jasmine leaned forward. The next time someone like me walks into your bank, young, minority, dressed like they work instead of like they invest, treat them like they might be carrying their grandmother's entire legacy in their pocket. Because they might be. And your judgment might be the difference between them accessing their inheritance with dignity or walking away ashamed. Richard nodded, and Jasmine could see he was actually listening. Actually absorbing. Thank you. For meeting with me. For being honest. You're welcome. As she stood to leave, Richard said one more thing. For what it's worth, your grandmother would be proud of how you handled that day. Of how you're handling all of this. Jasmine paused. You didn't know my grandmother. No. But I know what it takes to raise someone with that kind of character. And it takes a lot more than money. On her way out of the coffee shop, Jasmine texted Maya. Just had the weirdest meeting. Tell you later. Then she walked to the bus stop. She'd been taking the bus since getting the winter coat, allowing herself that small comfort, and thought about whether apologies meant anything if they came after the damage was done. She decided they did. Not because they erased harm, but because they acknowledged it. And acknowledgement was the first step toward change, even if change came too late for the people who'd already been hurt. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother, paid the deposit for BU housing. It's real now. Jasmine smiled. It was real. Her grandmother's 40 years of saving. Her mother's acceptance. Her own choice to take up space in a world that kept trying to make her smaller. All of it was real. And Richard Holloway's apology, however imperfect, was just one more piece of a story that was still being written. A story about a girl with worn-out shoes who'd learned that dignity wasn't something you wore on your feet. It was something you carried in your spine. And no amount of judgment could take it away. April arrived with the kind of warmth that made Boston believe in redemption. Jasmine walked through the Common on a Saturday afternoon, cherry blossoms beginning to open, the city shedding its winter shell. She stopped at a sporting goods store on Boylston Street. Not because she needed anything, but because she decided it was time. Inside, rows of sneakers lined the walls, bright colors, new designs, shoes that cost more than her mother made in 2 days of work. A young employee approached, college-aged, wearing a name tag that read Marcus. He smiled. "Can I help you find something?" Jasmine looked down at her feet. At the Converse she'd worn for 2 years, the ones with duct tape inside and frayed laces and rubber worn so thin you could see the canvas beneath. "I need new shoes," she said. "What kind are you looking for?" "Something that'll last." Marcus nodded. "Professional." He didn't look at her shoes with judgment. Didn't make assumptions. Just asked questions. "What's your main activity?" "Running?" "Walking?" "Just every day?" "Walking." "A lot of walking." "Budget?" Jasmine almost laughed. Budget. She could buy every pair of shoes in this store without noticing the money was gone. Something good. Not the cheapest, not the most expensive. Just something that works. Marcus showed her several options, explaining the differences between brands and styles with genuine enthusiasm. Jasmine tried on 4 pairs before finding ones that felt right: gray and teal, cushion soles, proper arch support, nothing flashy but solidly made. "These feel good," she said. "Great. Want to walk around in them? Make sure they're comfortable." She did. Walked the length of the store and back, feeling the difference immediately. These shoes didn't pinch. Didn't rub. Didn't require duct tape or crossed fingers or prayers that they'd last 1 more month. "I'll take them." At the register, Marcus rang them up. "That'll be $87. Jasmine handed him her debit card, the one connected to her grandmother's account. The one she'd been afraid to use for anything except absolute necessities. The one that represented 40 years of sacrifice and saving and planning. The transaction went through without issue. Marcus bagged her old shoes. She'd wanted to throw them away, but couldn't quite bring herself to, and handed her the new ones in their box. "You're all set. Enjoy them." "Thank you." As Jasmine walked out wearing her new shoes, she felt something shift. Not just the physical comfort, though that was real and immediate. But something psychological. For 2 years, she'd walked 6 miles a day in shoes that were falling apart. Had duct taped them and repaired them and made them last far beyond their intended life because buying new ones felt like an admission that her family couldn't provide. But her grandmother had provided. Had worked for 40 years specifically so Jasmine wouldn't have to make those calculations. Wouldn't have to choose between shoes and food, between comfort and survival, between taking up space and staying small. The new shoes were permission. Permission to accept help. Permission to use resources. Permission to walk through the world without apologizing for needing basic things. Jasmine walked all the way home in her new shoes, 6 miles she didn't have to walk because she could afford the bus now. But she walked anyway, because she wanted to feel the difference. Wanted to remember what her old shoes had taught her about endurance and dignity and making do. But also wanted to feel what her new shoes represented, that endurance didn't have to last forever. That dignity could exist alongside comfort. That making do wasn't virtue, it was just what you did until something better became possible. When she got home, her mother was at the kitchen table paying bills. "Where've you been?" Lynn asked without looking up. Jasmine stood in the doorway. "I bought new shoes." Lynn looked up then. Saw the box under Jasmine's arm, the new sneakers on her daughter's feet. Her expression flickered, pride mixed with something that might have been grief. "They look good. They feel good. What did you do with your old ones?" Jasmine pulled them out of the bag. The worn Converse that had carried her 2,400 miles over 2 years. That had walked her through grief and poverty and determination. I was going to throw them away, Jasmine said. But I couldn't. Lynn held out her hand. Let me see them. Jasmine gave her the shoes. Watched her mother turn them over, examining the worn soles and frayed laces and the places where Jasmine had patched them with duct tape hidden inside. I didn't know it was this bad, Lynn said quietly. I didn't want you to know. Why not? Because you would have bought me new ones. And you couldn't afford them. And I didn't want to be one more thing you had to worry about. Lynn set the shoes down on the table. You carried all of that alone. Not alone. Grandma was carrying it too. In her own way. They sat in silence for a moment, the old shoes between them like artifacts from a life they were both trying to move past without forgetting. Can I keep these? Lynn asked. Why? Because I want to remember. I want to remember that my daughter walked 6 miles a day in shoes held together with duct tape and never once complained. I want to remember what strength looks like. What your grandmother taught you. What you taught me. Jasmine felt tears start. They're just shoes, Mom. No, they're not. They're proof that we made it. That we survived. That we did what we had to do until we could do better. Lynn picked up one shoe, running her finger along the worn sole. But we're doing better now. Because of your grandmother. Because she gave us permission to stop surviving and start living. She'd want you to use some of the money too, you know. I know. And maybe I will. Someday. When I'm ready. Lynn set the shoe down gently. But for now, you use it. You go to be you. You buy shoes that don't fall apart. You take up all the space you've been taught to avoid. You live the life she worked 40 years to give you. I will. And Jasmine? Yeah? Thank you for telling me. Even though it was hard. Even though it hurt. Thank you for trusting me with the truth. Jasmine came around the table and hugged her mother, and they stayed like that for a long time, two women who'd learned that love sometimes looked like sacrifice and sometimes looked like secrets and sometimes looked like new shoes bought without guilt. That night, Lynn took Jasmine's old Converse and put them on a shelf in the closet, next to Sylvie's peacoat and a photo of the 3 generations together. A memorial to hard times. A reminder of who they'd been. And a promise of who they were becoming. Word spread fast in the senior center that Jasmine had inherited money from her grandmother. Not because Jasmine told anyone. But because Mrs. Patel's cousin volunteered there on Thursdays, and Mrs. Patel had mentioned it in casual conversation, and in a community of elderly people with limited entertainment, news traveled at the speed of gossip. When Jasmine arrived for her usual Saturday volunteer shift in May, 3 months before she'd leave for college, the atmosphere was different. Mr. Kowalski, the man she'd been reading to for 2 years, greeted her with unexpected formality. Miss Chin-Baptiste. I heard about your good fortune. Hi, Mr. K. You ready for the next chapter? You don't have to volunteer here anymore, you know. You've got money now. Can spend your Saturdays doing teenager things. Jasmine sat in her usual chair beside his wheelchair. I'm here because I want to be. Money doesn't change that. Don't it? He looked at her skeptically. Most people get money, they forget where they came from. Forget the people who knew them when they had nothing. My grandmother left me that money specifically because I'm the kind of person who doesn't forget. She saved for 40 years watching me care about people. If I stopped now, it would mean she was wrong about me. Mr. Kowalski studied her face, then smiled. She wasn't wrong. I knew Sylvie. Knew her well. Used to see her here every Thursday playing cards with your group. She talked about you like you walked on water. She did? Every chance she got. My Jasmine, she reads to the people nobody visits. My Jasmine, she don't need extra credit for school, she just does it because she cares. Made the rest of us jealous our grandkids didn't come around. Jasmine felt her throat tighten. I didn't know she talked about me here. Every week. With pride. With hope. He reached over and patted her hand with his weathered fingers. She'd be proud of you still coming. Proud you didn't let money make you different. But that wasn't entirely true. The money had changed things. Over the next hour, Jasmine noticed it. The way some residents looked at her differently. With deference. With calculation. With the particular brightness that comes into people's eyes when they see you as a resource. Mrs. Alston, who'd always been friendly but distant, suddenly wanted to talk about her grandson who needed help with college tuition. Mr. Reeves mentioned that his daughter's medical bills were overwhelming, just casually, just in conversation. Even sweet Mrs. Kim, who'd never asked for anything, wondered aloud if Jasmine might know of any scholarships for immigrant families. They weren't being greedy. They were being human. Seeing a young woman with money and hoping some of it might spill over onto their own desperate situations. And Jasmine understood, suddenly and completely, what her grandmother had meant about money changing how people saw you. She wasn't just Jasmine anymore. She was Jasmine who had money. Jasmine who could help. Jasmine who might be the solution to problems she didn't create and couldn't fix. After her shift, the senior center director, Michael Chen, no relation, asked to speak with her privately. They sat in his office, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and heartbreak. I heard about your inheritance, Michael said. I wanted to check in. See how you're doing with all of it. I'm okay. Are you? Because I noticed some tension out there today. People treating you differently. Yeah. I noticed too. Michael leaned back in his chair. That's what happens when people find out you have money. Especially in communities like this where everyone's struggling. You become hope. And hope is a heavy thing to carry. I can't save everyone. No, you can't. But they'll ask anyway. And you'll have to learn to say no, which is one of the hardest things a kind person can do. Jasmine hadn't thought about that. Hadn't considered that wealth meant not just having resources but having to decide who deserved them and who didn't. My grandmother saved that money for my education, Jasmine said carefully. Not for everyone else's problems. I know that. You know that. But people in desperate situations don't always see those boundaries. They just see someone who can help and isn't helping. So what do? You set boundaries. Firmly but kindly. You keep volunteering if that's what you want to do. But you make it clear that your presence here is about service, not about charity. That you're here to read and talk and be present, not to write checks. Jasmine nodded. Has this happened before? With volunteers who had money? Occasionally. It's human nature. People see resources and they reach for them, especially when they're drowning. I don't want to stop coming. Then don't. But maybe have a conversation with some of the regulars. Let them know that your grandmother's money has a specific purpose and that purpose is your future. Most of them will understand. The ones who don't, well, that tells you something about them. After leaving Michael's office, Jasmine sat in her car for a long time, the same old Honda her mother drove, the one that barely started in cold weather, the one they'd never replaced because why spend money when something still worked? She thought about her grandmother. About 40 years of people seeing Sylvie as someone who could be used. A housekeeper. A worker. Someone whose labor had value but whose humanity was optional. And she thought about what it meant to have money in a world full of people who didn't. It meant carrying guilt. Carrying other people's hope. Carrying the weight of being able to help and choosing when not to. It meant learning that kindness couldn't solve everything. That caring about people didn't obligate you to save them. That boundaries were necessary even when they felt cruel. Her grandmother had known this. Had lived with this knowledge for the 3 years since putting the money in Jasmine's name. Had seen people ask for help and had to say no, saving every dollar for a specific purpose, for a specific person, for a specific future. How lonely that must have been. How isolating. To have resources and keep them hidden. To love people and still refuse them. To know you could ease someone's burden and choose not to because doing so would compromise a longer plan. Jasmine understood her grandmother differently now. Sylvie hadn't just given her money. She'd given her an education in the ethics of wealth. In the complicated truth that helping one person sometimes meant saying no to hundreds of others. That love was specific, not universal. That you couldn't save everyone, so you saved the one person you could reach. And Sylvie had chosen Jasmine. Not because she was better than anyone else. But because she was hers. Because blood and love and belief created obligations that existed outside of fairness or logic or democratic distribution of resources. Jasmine started the car and drove home, understanding for the first time why her grandmother had kept secrets. Because sometimes love meant protecting what you'd built, even when that protection looked like selfishness to everyone else. Sometimes it meant choosing one future over 100 presents. And sometimes the hardest part of having money wasn't spending it. It was living with the knowledge of what you weren't spending it on. In June, 1 month before move-in day at BU, Jasmine's English teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, asked to see her after class. "You're going to BU in the fall," Ms. Rodriguez said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Full scholarship, I heard." "Pretty much." Ms. Rodriguez pulled out a sheet of paper. "Have you thought about applying for additional private scholarships? Even with financial aid, there are books, supplies, personal expenses." "I'm covered." "Are you?" Ms. Rodriguez looked at her directly. Because the Jasmine I've known for 4 years wouldn't say she's covered unless something changed. Jasmine hesitated. Ms. Rodriguez was one of the few teachers who'd actually seen her. Who'd noticed when she was wearing the same clothes 2 days in a row. Who'd quietly left granola bars in her desk sometimes, disguised as classroom snacks so Jasmine wouldn't feel singled out. "My grandmother left me money," Jasmine said finally. "For college. I'm okay." Ms. Rodriguez's expression softened with something like relief. "Good. That's really good, Jasmine. But I want you to do something for me." "What?" "Write about it." "About what?" "About your grandmother. About the inheritance. About what it means to be the recipient of someone's life's work." Ms. Rodriguez leaned forward. "You're going to be surrounded by students at BU who've had opportunities their whole lives. Students who've never had to patch their shoes or walk 6 miles to save bus fare. Students who don't understand what it means to carry 40 years of someone else's sacrifice. I know. Do you? Because they won't understand you, Jasmine. They'll look at you and see scholarship kid, minority student, diversity admit. They won't see the strength it took to get there. They won't see your grandmother's hands or your mother's exhaustion or your own dignity under pressure. So what do? You write it down. You tell the story. Not for them, they probably won't get it anyway. but for yourself. So you remember where you came from. So you remember that your success isn't despite your background. It's because of it. Ms. Rodriguez pulled out another sheet of paper, a scholarship application for the first Commonwealth Bank Community Leadership Award. I want you to apply for this. The deadline is next week. The essay prompt is, describe a moment when you understood the true meaning of resilience. Jasmine looked at the application. I don't need more money. This isn't about money. It's about recognition. About having your story on record. About making sure that somewhere, in some database, it's documented that a girl with worn-out shoes and her grandmother's legacy changed her own trajectory through sheer force of character. You really want me to write about standing at that bank counter being humiliated? I want you to write about standing at that bank counter and refusing to be diminished. About dignity in the face of dismissal. About the moment you realized your worth wasn't determined by someone else's judgment. Ms. Rodriguez's voice got intense. That's the story, Jasmine. Not the money. Not the scholarship. The moment you stood there and said, I belong here. And I don't need your permission to exist in this space. Jasmine took the application home that night. She sat at the kitchen table where her grandmother had written her letter. Where her mother paid bills and worried and planned. Where generations of women in her family had made calculations about survival and sacrifice and love. And she began to write. Not about the money, though the money was part of it. But about shoes. About walking. About the miles that taught her endurance. About the grandmother who'd seen a little girl reading to elderly strangers and decided she was worth 40 years of saving. She wrote about the bank counter. About Richard Holloway's dismissive laughter. About the postal worker who'd watched with knowing eyes. About the balance on the screen that changed everything and nothing at the same time. She wrote about her mother's anger and hurt and eventual acceptance. About the grief that came with realizing your sacrifice wasn't necessary but was still valuable. About the complicated truth that love could look like secrets and still be love. She wrote until 2 a.m, her hand cramping, her heart raw, the words pouring out in a way they never had before. When she finished, she read it over once. It wasn't perfect. But it was true. She submitted the application the next morning. 2 weeks later, she got a call from First Commonwealth Bank's Community Relations Director. She'd won the award. $5,000 and a feature in their annual report. Richard Holloway would be presenting it. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. On the day of the award ceremony, Jasmine wore her new shoes and her grandmother's ring and a dress her mother had bought her for graduation. She stood in the bank's conference room surrounded by local business leaders and community advocates and journalists with cameras. Richard Holloway stood at the podium, looking older and more humble than he had 6 months ago when he'd laughed at her. It's my honor to present this year's Community Leadership Award to Jasmine Chen Baptiste, he said, reading from prepared remarks. Jasmine's essay about resilience and dignity in the face of judgment reminded all of us at First Commonwealth what banking should be about, serving people, not serving assumptions. He paused, going off script. Several months ago, I made a mistake with this young woman. I judged her based on her appearance instead of her character. I dismissed her instead of serving her. And she responded not with anger but with dignity that shamed me more than any complaint could have. The room was silent, everyone understanding they were witnessing something rare, a public reckoning. This award is given to students who demonstrate exceptional character and resilience. Jasmine demonstrated both. Not just in achieving academic success despite economic challenges, but in maintaining her humanity when people like me tried to take it from her. He turned to face Jasmine directly. You taught me that wealth isn't measured in what you have. It's measured in how you treat people. Particularly people society has taught us to dismiss. He handed her the award, a plaque in an envelope with the check. Thank you, Mr. Holloway, Jasmine said into the microphone. I accept this award in honor of my grandmother, Sylvie Baptiste, who spent 40 years teaching me that dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you carry with you no matter what. The room applauded. After the ceremony, the postal worker from that first day, the one who'd watched the whole thing unfold, approached Jasmine. Congratulations, young lady. I knew you'd be all right. Thank you for staying. For witnessing. Someone had to. Someone always has to witness when dignity faces down dismissal. That's how we know who won. He shook her hand and walked away, and Jasmine understood that some allies don't speak. They just stand there, bearing witness, making sure you're not alone when the world tries to make you small. She deposited the check into her college account, not because she needed it, but because her grandmother would have wanted her to accept recognition for what she'd endured. And she kept the plaque on her desk as a reminder. Not of the money. Not of the bank. But of the moment she stood at a counter in worn-out shoes and refused to apologize for existing. That was the inheritance that mattered. The rest was just numbers in an account. August arrived with humidity and hope. Jasmine stood in the BU student housing parking lot with 3 suitcases, 2 boxes of books, and a mother who was trying very hard not to cry. You have everything? Lynn asked for the 5th time. I have everything. Bedding? Towels? The first aid kit I made you? Yes, Mom. And you'll call me every day? Every day. I promised. Lynn wiped her eyes, trying to be strong. Around them, other families unloaded SUVs and trucks, parents hugging children who were trying to look independent while clearly being terrified. I can't believe you're really doing this, Lynn said softly. College. Real college. Not community college or part-time while working. Just college. Because of Grandma. Because of you. She gave you the money, but you earned the admission. You did the work. A student volunteer with a welcome class of 2030 shirt approached with a rolling cart. Need help with your stuff? Yes, please, Jasmine said. They loaded everything onto the cart. Jasmine's dorm was in Warren Towers, 9th floor, room 914. She'd be sharing with 2 roommates, a girl from Connecticut named Emma and another from California named Sarah. She'd stalked their social media already. They seemed nice. Normal. Completely unaware of what it meant to walk 6 miles in worn-out shoes. As they rode the elevator up, Lynn was silent, taking in the building's size, the other students laughing and greeting each other, the overwhelming reality of a world she'd never been part of. Room 914 was small but bright, with 3 beds, 3 desks, 3 wardrobes. Emma had already arrived and claimed the bed by the window. She was blonde, friendly, genuinely excited to meet Jasmine. You're the one from Boston. Oh my God, you can show me around. I'm totally lost here already. They made small talk while Lynn helped Jasmine unpack. Her mother folded clothes with her usual precision, arranged toiletries in the shared bathroom, set up the desk with supplies they'd bought together. You sure you don't need anything else? Lynn asked. I'm sure, Mom. Because I can stay. Help you settle. I know. But I need to figure this out myself. Lynn nodded, understanding but hating it. Okay. Okay, I'll go. They walked back to the parking lot together. At the car, Lynn hugged Jasmine so tightly it hurt. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. So proud. I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby. More than you know. Lynn got in the car, started it on the third try, and drove away slowly. Jasmine watched until the Honda disappeared around the corner. Then she stood in the parking lot, alone, on the threshold of a life she'd only imagined. She thought about her grandmother. About every early morning, every late shift, every dollar saved. About the 40-year plan that culminated in this moment, a girl standing in front of a university she'd earned the right to attend. She thought about her mother. About the pulled couch and the skipped meals and the endless work. About love that looked like sacrifice and pride that looked like stubbornness and acceptance that came slowly and painfully and ultimately with grace. She thought about her shoes. The old ones sitting on a shelf in her mother's closet like a memorial. The new ones on her feet carrying her forward. And she walked back into the building, up to the 9th floor, into room 914 where Emma was playing music and Sarah had just arrived from the airport and life was about to become something entirely new. That night, after her roommates fell asleep, Jasmine stood at the window looking out at the city lights of Boston spread below like a promise. She pulled out her phone and called her mother as promised. "Hey, baby. You okay?" "I'm perfect, Mom. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Good. That's good." Lynn's voice was thick with emotion. "Your grandmother would be so happy." "I know. Call me tomorrow?" "I will." After they hung up, Jasmine stayed at the window for a long time, thinking about inheritance and sacrifice and the complicated truth that sometimes the greatest gift is permission to become more than you thought possible. Her grandmother had given her that. And now it was up to Jasmine to honor it. Not by being perfect. Not by never struggling. Not by pretending the journey had been easy. But by living fully. By taking up space. By refusing to be small. By walking through the world with the dignity Sylvie had modeled for 40 years. By remembering where she came from while reaching for where she wanted to go. By being exactly who she was, the granddaughter of a housekeeper who'd understood that wealth wasn't measured in what you kept but in what you gave away. And in that moment, standing in her dorm room with 2 sleeping roommates in a city full of possibility below, Jasmine Chen Baptiste understood what her grandmother had been trying to tell her all along. You don't need permission to exist in spaces people say aren't for you. You just need courage. And shoes that don't fall apart before you get there. For years later, on a May morning bright with promise, Jasmine Chen Baptiste stood on the BU graduation stage wearing a cap and gown and her grandmother's ring. She'd made it. For years of hard work and late nights and moments of doubt. For years of learning that belonging wasn't given but claimed. That privilege was complicated and poverty was resilient and neither defined you completely. She'd majored in social work. Because after 4 years of watching classmates who'd never struggled with basic needs try to understand poverty from textbooks, she'd decided someone needed to bridge that gap. Someone who understood both worlds. Her mother sat in the audience, wearing a new dress she'd bought without guilt. Lynn had finally quit her evening job, finally taken her bedroom back, finally allowed some of the inheritance to make her own life easier. Not all of it. But some. Progress. After the ceremony, as families swarmed the lawn taking photos, Jasmine's phone buzzed. An email from First Commonwealth Bank. She almost deleted it, thinking it was promotional. But something made her open it. Dear Miss Chen Baptiste. This is Richard Holloway. I hope this email finds you well on your graduation day. I wanted to reach out because I'm retiring from First Commonwealth after 32 years, and there's something I need to tell you. Your essay, the one you wrote for the Community Leadership Award, has become required reading in our employee training program. Every new hire at First Commonwealth reads about that day at the counter. About your worn-out shoes and my dismissive laughter. About the balance I saw and the lesson I learned. We use it to teach about implicit bias and dignity and the way assumptions can blind us to people's humanity. I wanted you to know that your story has trained over 400 employees in the past 4 years. And anecdotally, our customer service complaints from young clients and clients of color have dropped by 60% since we implemented this training. You changed me that day. But more than that, you changed how an entire institution thinks about who belongs in its spaces. Thank you for your patience. Your dignity. Your willingness to exist in rooms where people tried to make you small. You taught us all what wealth really looks like. Respectfully, Richard Holloway. Jasmine read the email twice, then showed it to her mother. Your grandmother would be proud, Lynn said softly. She'd be more proud of you. For letting me go. For accepting help. For choosing possibility over pride. It wasn't easy. The important things never are. That evening, back in Jasmine's small apartment, the one she could afford now, with her own money, earned through summer internships and part-time work and the interest that had accumulated on her grandmother's savings, she sat down to write a letter of her own. Not to mail anywhere. Just to write. To process. To remember. Dear Grandma. I graduated today. Summa cum laude. Full scholarship for my master's program in social work. Job offers from 3 nonprofits. A life you worked 40 years to make possible. But you know what I'm most proud of? I'm proud that I never forgot where I came from. That I can walk into a boardroom or a bank or a university building and hold my head high. Not because I have money now. But because you taught me that dignity isn't purchased. It's earned through how you treat people when no one is watching. I think about you every time I put on my shoes. Every time I walk into a space where people assume I don't belong. Every time someone looks at me and makes calculations about who I must be based on how I appear. And I stand a little taller. Because you stood tall for 40 years while people looked right through you. You were never invisible, Grandma. Not to me. Not to Mom. Not to the people you cleaned for who probably never saw you as fully human. You were always there. Always working. Always planning. Always building something bigger than yourself. And now I get to live in the world you built. Thank you for seeing me. For believing I was worth 40 years of sacrifice. For giving me not just money but permission. Permission to be big. To take up space. To refuse to shrink. I won't waste it. I promise you that. Love always, Jasmine. She folded the letter and put it in the box where she kept her grandmother's other letter, the bank book, the photographs from the safety deposit box. Then she pulled out her laptop and started writing her graduate school application essay. The prompt: describe how your personal experiences have shaped your commitment to social justice. Jasmine smiled and began typing. I grew up understanding that wealth and worth are not the same thing. My grandmother, Sylvie Baptiste, worked as a housekeeper for 42 years. The story poured out. The whole story. The worn-out shoes and the bank counter and the inheritance and the complicated truth that money solves some problems while creating others. She wrote until dawn, until the sky outside her window turned from black to gray to gold. And when she finished, she reread it once and knew it was true. Not just factually true, but emotionally true. The kind of truth that couldn't be captured in numbers or accounts or balances. The kind of truth that lived in the space between what people saw and who you actually were. The kind of truth her grandmother had understood completely. That you could be poor and powerful, invisible and influential, small in the world's eyes and massive in your impact. That dignity wasn't something you wore. It was something you carried. In your spine. In your stride. In the way you stood at counters where people laughed at you and refused to be diminished. In the shoes that held you up when everything else fell apart. In the grandmother who saved 40 years because she believed in a future she'd never see. In the mother who worked herself to exhaustion because love looked like sacrifice. In the daughter who walked 6 miles a day and learned that endurance was its own kind of wealth. Jasmine saved the document, submitted her application, and went to bed as the city woke up around her. She didn't know yet that she'd get into her first choice program. Didn't know that 10 years later she'd be running a nonprofit that helped low-income families navigate inheritance and financial planning. Didn't know that her grandmother's story would become a case study in intergenerational wealth building for communities that had historically been excluded from it. She didn't know any of that yet. She just knew she'd made it. Had honored the legacy. Had carried the weight of 40 years of saving and turned it into something that mattered. And somewhere, in whatever place grandmothers go when their work is done, Sylvie Baptiste smiled. Because the plan had worked exactly as intended. Not to make Jasmine wealthy, but to make her free. Free to choose. Free to grow. Free to exist in spaces that said she didn't belong and prove them wrong just by being there. Free to walk through the world in shoes that didn't fall apart before she reached her destination. That was the inheritance. Not the money. The freedom. And Jasmine had claimed it completely.